It's 14 minutes after 7. You're still watching the AM show. We've had procurement issues in this country. I'm sure that all of us are familiar with sole sourcing. We hear that a lot. And even though we know that they say sole sourcing is not good, you have to open it up, let people come on board. But we hear sole sourcing all the time. Haven't we been buying from China and not locally sourcing as well? That's been very topical in the news recently, and that's why I'm excited to be having this conversation with Andre Coetzee. He's Managing Director of CIPS Africa. That's the Chartered Institute of Procurement Supply Africa. I've also got with me Dr. Teta Fote-Walters. He's a fellow of the Institute, Strategic Advisory, also of the Institute. Can I say good morning and thank you for your time?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Right. Okay. So, Andre, you're coming from South Africa. So, let's start with a little of what happens in South Africa in terms of public procurement, and then we'll see how we relate to what you say.
In your introduction, and again, thank you very much. In your introduction, you could have had that same introduction in a show in South Africa, in Botswana, in Zambia, and all over. So the issues that you face in Ghana are pretty much the same issues we face. If you look at issues like procurement, public sector procurement, it's huge in the spotlight at the moment because of the value that it can create within a country. But unfortunately, through various innovative methods, if I can call it that, that value is not created, and some of the funds that actually should go and better the lives for the ordinary folk actually don't even reach that. So that's a huge problem in South Africa, and I think it's a problem that we all face, not even in Africa but across the world. But fortunately, the South African government has actually placed a huge focus on procurement and on procurement reform because they realize how strategic procurement is in the growth of South Africa. So in that respect, they've actually appointed a government CPO, a Chief Procurement Officer, and that Chief Procurement Officer is now looking at how to better the system so that we can move away from the old regime into a new regime where we can start to unlock efficiencies through public sector procurement.
So are you used to sole sourcing? Is that a common thing in South Africa currently whilst you wait to move to this new?
No, not necessarily, but there are other issues that actually face us. And the interesting thing, it's not only in the public sector, because if you look at, and coming back to the 2010 Soccer World Cup, when a lot of our construction companies were actually tasked to construct these huge stadiums, there was also a huge finding of collusion and price manipulation amongst those organizations, and also just indicating that this problem that we face as procurement people is not only in the public sector. Yes, that's a big portion of it, but private sector also has got problems.
Okay, so Dr. Fote-Walters, I have been educated a bit, and I'm told that there are psychological, cultural, social, there's so many reasons, when you're going into procurement, there are a lot of things that you have to be thinking about. One of the areas that we want to go is going green. At least the Institute has been hitting on this a lot. I just want you to explain to our viewers what going green with procurement means.
Thank you very much. Green procurement, which is also known in other areas as sustainable procurement, came as a result of a UN declaration for sustainable development when it was realized that the rate at which we depleting the environment was on the high. And that led to questions like, if governments or corporate institutions want to have goods, services, works, and what have you, who is responsible? And then we saw the procurement professional playing the center stage. So then it means that if you really want to work at improving the way things are done, then the focus should be on procurement. Now, green procurement simply means that we will have to make sure that the world as it is now, we would live in it, utilize whatever in it, but we don't destroy it, and make sure it is restored for future generations to come. Now, it is the responsibility of the procurement professional to understand the dynamics of how the types of interventions that we'll have to introduce into any procurement activity at all that we do to ensure that we protect the environment. You can think about a few years ago, I think it happens with some of our health institutions. I have witnessed a health institution where expired products are buried as a means of disposal. Now, when the product expires, it becomes poisonous. So now, if you bury it in the earth, then what happens is we're destroying that portion of the earth. It means you cannot even use it for anything else. Now, the question is, what role will procurement have to do to ensure that things like this don't happen?
Okay, so my understanding here is that procurement just goes beyond purchasing or buying. You have a certain responsibility even as a procurement person.
It goes far beyond that.
Okay.
It goes in terms of making sure that whatever we do would not have any negative impact on the earth.
Okay. And my understanding also is that we have a certain responsibility towards improving the immediate environment where we find ourselves. So if you're a procurement person and you're supposed to be procuring certain items, you must look at doing so in your immediate environment. Am I correct?
You're 100% correct. And I think that is so important. And just to add to what Dr. Walters has said, and that is the influence that a procurement professional can actually have. So if you procure from a supplier, you can actually write the specifications and the terms of reference for that contract in such a way that they comply to look after the immediate environment. But also there's a responsibility to look further down the value chain, because sometimes some of the products that we actually buy or procure is made up from various suppliers. So you've also got to have visibility to your tier 2, tier 3 and tier 4 suppliers actually assembling that product. So you might end up in your first or tier 1 supplier that actually is compliant, but do you actually know where some of those smaller components actually come from, how they're made, how green are those suppliers in terms of supplying that? So responsibility is to your immediate environment, but also to look down the supply chain or the value chain to see what's happening in your tier 3, tier 4 suppliers.
So say, we take a company, like Kraft, for instance. Would it be their responsibility, there's a procurement person, to, if I'm looking at the value chain down the line, to see where, if they buy cocoa from Ghana, for instance, do they have to know where the cocoa is coming from, who is harvesting the cocoa, who are they using to work, so that if there are children involved, for instance, they have a certain responsibility there?
Thank you very much. I think green procurement, look at what you call the triple bottom line. And then these things, one, look at the environment, you have the economic aspect, and then the social. Now, what you just mentioned has got to do with the social aspect of green procurement. Now, the social aspect looks at why, throughout the value chain or the supply chain network, who is qualified to be working in a particular industry. Are underage kids qualified to be employed to be working? In this country, we hear parents will say, my son, my daughter is on afternoon shift, so this morning he's taking me to the farm to help. But if you're going to procure, what you need to do is you need to integrate backwards into the source of supply. Andre mentioned the tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you need to understand who are the players in the products that you want to buy. Now, if this is a policy of the organization that socially we make sure we don't procure things from countries or suppliers who use child labor, which is against International Labor Organization's rules, then if you use them, you don't qualify to supply. But typically, let me just cite this. You know, when we go to the market in the mornings over the weekend, where I live, we have these young children they call dropping. I don't know whether you've come across them. When you go to buy, these kids are there, and then they will want to help you
carry your stuff.
Exactly.
So this is not KIA.
I mean, why do you use underage? Primarily, it's wrong. Even for our domestic works, you don't have to employ them. And it's one thing I have always protested against. It is not for them to work. And you see, we have missed on some of these things because of the policy drive, where it should come from, the standards which should be built into what you call the sustainable or green procurement. And I know the Public Procurement Authority has started doing some few things around it. They started some trainings.
As in training for suppliers?
No, training for, I think, procurement people.
Okay, but is that all? Because, you know, you are the procurement people, so you know the ethics of your profession. You know the rules and regulations, but the person you're buying from may not necessarily know. Isn't that where the authority has to do a lot more education and training? Maybe I should ask you, Andre, do you have a board back in South Africa, or maybe the African experience, and what is the responsibility of the board towards the supplier?
I think there's a huge responsibility, and again, Dr. Walters spoke about the triple bottom line, so that's where green procurement sits. So there's a huge responsibility on the boards of organizations to ensure that the whole value chain is sort of, let's call it clean. Because the risk is, again, and maybe if I can just take one step back and in terms of answering your question, if you look at the demographics of especially Africa, there's a lot of young people in Africa, and we know young people are very attuned to technology, and also if I look at my attitude towards green procurement versus my children's attitude towards green procurement, they're much more radical about this. And the problem is, so they are the consumers of the future. So if something has to go wrong with the product that they buy, the minute they sense that there is something wrong, for instance, I think there was one of the big sports shoe manufacturers that was sort of cited to use child labor in one of their factories, it is immediately that thing goes viral, and it's got a huge impact on that business. It's got huge impact on shareholder value. So coming back to your question, so there's a huge responsibility on the board to ensure that everything is above board, so to speak. And again, that is where the procurement professional comes in terms of supply relationship management. So you can't just sit there and just take their word that everything is okay. You've got to go out there and investigate and go look, because if things go wrong, people are going to hang you, and that's a huge responsibility.
Yeah. So fortunately for us, we have an authority that's supposed to be supervising this whole procurement sector. Is the supplier their responsibility too?
Well, I think in terms of the law, there is, just coming to the authority, so there is, and I'm not 100% sure in Ghana, but I'm sure there would be laws in terms of green procurement. But in the end of the day, it's the responsibility of the procurement professional to see that they operate within that framework.
Okay.
Because, again, maybe just to add something, and that's always been something that I find quite interesting, when everything goes well, green procurement is high on the agenda, and we're very happy to save the environment. But when there's a crisis, for instance, I see that you also have a problem with electricity supply in Ghana, and the same in South Africa. Just to give you
yeah, but I say that yours is not as intense as ours.
Well, I guess it is. Well, it's all relative because we feel the pinch. It's got a huge impact on our economy as it has on yours. But the point that I would like to make is, you know, we can be very sort of okay about CO2 emissions when everything goes well. We've got diesel turbines in South Africa that was there for the sole purpose of backup in case there's a shortfall. Because of our crisis now, they are becoming one of the primary sources of electricity generation. And where is the green issue now? Because there are liters and tons of diesel being burned to drive those turbines. So I've always got a bit of a problem when everything goes well. You know, if you look at the 2008 financial crisis, before that, green procurement and the whole issue of green was very high on the agenda. When the 2008 financial crisis came, that whole debate kind of disappeared. It was, and I think that is something that we need to sort out. I'm not always sure that we understand and that we are as committed to green procurement as we should be.
Dr. Otis, I mean, you and I, this is our home. Recently, we've been procuring strangely from outside, particularly China, and the excuse has always been the local producers cannot meet, you know, the deadline. But I want to ask the basic question of, is there a deadline? Is there a rush when it comes to procurements?
Oops, this is quite an interesting one. I always maintain that procurement, if it's done right, shouldn't be in a rush. If you look at, especially in government, I mean, if you look at this country, budget is read once in a year. Typically, that is how it works. And prior to that, all requirements of public institutions will have to be put together in their procurement plans, which will be incorporated into the national budget. And approval will be given, appropriation will be passed by Parliament. And that is when it will start taking effect. I don't see where the rush will come in. Because if we need to procure an item in a particular year and we have planned for it and approval, and that is what we're taking through, we've defended it, and it will be approved. What we could start doing is we could start running a process till the contract award stage. That could even be held on till the appropriation bill is passed. Because a procurement process will run through evaluation and everything done till a recommendation is still not a contract. So the government, under the doctrine of termination for convenience, can decide to cancel the whole process because of lack of funds. So if we go through that route, there shouldn't be that pressure in buying. I can understand when you're using a table like this and it crashes immediately, then that can call for an urgent response. But where we're sitting, if you want to change these settees, I think you have a lot of time to think about its depreciation and plan towards it. If it's done properly, there shouldn't be any rush at all in our procurement process. Adding to what Andre talked about when you asked about the authority and their relationship with suppliers. What authority does, the authority manages the law. And they say that we want this country to go sustainably in terms of procurement. Now, when they think education has gone through and that administrative instructions and everything is gone on well, then they can direct that all public institutions, maybe within this period, we're giving you this lead time, we would want to see that all of you have incorporated the sustainability requirements in your tendering process, because then they would amend the tender document, because we use one standard tender document. So then they would amend it for all institutions to use. So then it is straight away incorporated into it. Now, the relationship with the suppliers is the responsibility of the procuring entities, as Andre said, so that the relationship management, the supplier relationship management should be very strong, where you try to engage the supply market and let them know, one, what is coming. Even your requirements for the year should not be hidden from the suppliers. The supply market should be aware of items that you will want to be procuring in the course of the year, so that they will have to prepare themselves before you even start rolling out your tendering process. If we do that, then the engagement becomes quite competitive, and then we will be able to appropriate real value.
Amazing. This is supposed to be a very transparent process.
That's correct.
But Andre, we've had excuses because our parliament recently purchased some chairs and tables from outside. We've had the judicial service new office building also purchasing from outside. The excuse is that we don't have the capacity, we don't have the local capacity to produce. Is that a good excuse? I'll tell you what the local manufacturers also say, that one person may not be able to produce, but usually they have associations. So if you give it to the associations, they know how to distribute it amongst themselves and do it. But the lack of local capacity, is it a good excuse in procurement not to do it sustainably?
I also almost want to say oops, but it's a very interesting question. I would think in certain cases where you look at very technical items that you actually are purchasing, you know, like aircraft engines and really high-tech stuff, that is probably sometimes a good excuse to say that we don't have the local capacity. But I'd like to come back to that. But I fail to understand, and that is just my perception, that in a country like Ghana, where that is a good excuse. So I would almost want to say I don't think it is a good excuse. I think there's a lot of skilled people, because us Africans are known for our skills and crafts, and I think furniture manufacturing is probably one of them. If I can, so I don't think it's a good excuse. I think we must use you know, all the means to develop our local supplies, and I think this was probably a project which the people could have used better to develop the local suppliers. Just to give you an example, we had a conference in Ghana 2 years ago, and one of the items that we needed for our conference was conference bags. And I left the organizers to go and source pricing for conference bags, and they came back and they said, here are 2-3 bags that we can procure for the conference, 700 bags. But unfortunately, none of those bags were actually manufactured in Ghana. So I actually said to them that I'm not going to buy one of those, because if you look at Ghana, if you look at the skills of some of the, I would almost imagine the ladies in manufacturing a beautiful bag from Ghana, why have you actually tried that route? And they said no, and I said please go. So what happened was, just through that small little intervention, those 700 bags were sourced from a local producer in Ghana. It created a job for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 ladies. And the quality of the bags were brilliant. They were beautiful. People even up to now say, you know, our Ghana conference bag was the best bag we've ever had, and it was at a lower price. So I think it's sometimes just a little bit of a mindset change in the small things that we do. And I think Dr. Walters mentioned in some of the local, the things that we do personally. That's how we can start to influence, you know, to develop our local community and our local suppliers.
So when we refuse to procure locally, does the authority, because we have a procurement authority, does it have a certain responsibility, Dr. Waters, to pull us back? You know, can they intervene in the process?
Yes. Yes, no. Now, you see, the legal regime for our procurement in this country has stated certain financial thresholds for our procurement and says that if the financial threshold goes beyond a certain limit, then you cannot procure the items in this country. It was looking at just the financial consideration. But then again, when we have to look at green procurement, the question is, can we get wood in this country to produce furniture? Do we even do it in this country at all? So if we do, then the total value of the project, the contract, should not be the sole determinant of how to source or the method of procurement to use. And if you look at the social and economic considerations of green procurement, then it's going to say that you need to situate this requirement you mentioned earlier within the context, within the confines of this country. Because the benefit of what you're going to get is going to create jobs and it's going to reduce unemployment. So we believe that if procurement is managed and managed properly, unemployment will be reduced. But if the law as it stands, then I guess that chances are the authority will say that because it goes beyond that threshold, then, well, you have to go international. But even that, if you're going international, then you still need to consider the Ghanaian companies as well. Because if it's an international competitive tendering process, you don't take the Ghanaian out of it. But then, unless you change and decide to use a non-open tendering process, and that would take us out of it.
Okay, so specifically, do we have a policy on sustainable procurement in Ghana? Going green, do we have a certain policy on it here?
I know the Public Procurement Authority and the Swiss Embassy are doing some level of sensitization as we go along.
Okay. Is that what we need, though? Because I have a feeling that, you know, we're looking at the bigger picture.
Yes.
And I always say, why don't we start from home when we make some of these calls? You know, for instance, like the Trades Ministry would say, buy made in Ghana goods. I always say, I mean, you're in public office. It's so easy for you to start from where you are when you're procuring, you know, for us as a country. So if we're preaching this sustainable procurement, why don't we start from that? Because it's so easy for you to start from that.
Exactly.
And then we can copy and follow suit.
I agree. And I think that is where it should start. And you see, the Public Procurement Authority cannot do this in isolation of our standards authority. Because most of the things we buy, the specification standards that are put on these things, the EU standards and other international ISO standards. And the standards authority can adapt them. I don't know how they're going to do it, but it's done. They adapt and coin it to Ghanaian standards. So that when you want these things, what you're going to do is when you're specifying the requirements, then you know the kind of standards we're talking about. But I think that, yes, the authority is working to get a policy or, yes, a law out. I think it might be an administrative instruction, or it could be in the amended.
On sustainable procurement.
Yes, on sustainable procurement.
Okay.
And when it comes out, what some of us expect to see is the authority going extra mile and require demand of all procuring entities a time limit within which we will have to demonstrate that these things are being implemented. And I think that is more important because they would have to follow through and make sure whatever is said is being done. And that would help, because if you give that policy directive and the procuring entities and procurement professionals know that this is what they have to do, then we will now have to make sure we comply. And in compliance, it means that we shifting and ensuring that green procurement works.
Okay, so Andre, what you've heard a lot about, you know, the procurement process in our country. I don't know what you want to leave us with. What should we be thinking about? How do we move from where we are?
I think, you know, one or two comments that I would like to make is that as Africans, and I would like to make a sort of a wider statement than Ghana or South Africans, or South Africa, is that we should look to develop our own manufacturing sectors. We have to look to start to buy local, and not, if I mean local, not necessarily only buy from Ghana, but you know, from South Africa, from Nigeria. So I think,
so instead of going to the Chinas and the Italys, we can even look at Africa.
We can look at Africa because we've got, I think we've got the people, we've got the resources. So I don't understand why we can't, you know, lift our game in, so to speak. Why can't we sort of have a Buy Africa sort of mindset? So that's the one thing. The other thing that is very encouraging, meeting with senior stakeholders in Ghana, that you can see there is a will to sort of change things to the better. There's a lot of thought going into this whole issue of procurement. So I think, you know, all of these things take time, as it does all over in our country as well. But certainly there's I think, a move in the right direction to get professional people to do procurement and not just only practitioners. So I'm very encouraged in what I see. So, but I think, you know, we all need to probably sharpen our pencil and have a real commitment towards this, because in the end of the day, the one profession that can change the economic future of Africa is procurement and supply chain management.
With that said, Dr. Foto Walters, when is your AGM?
This evening.
This evening, okay.
We're starting from 4:30 to 6 o'clock. We are at Novotel, so we inviting.
So it's open to everybody?
Everybody.
Oh, okay.
So you can pass by.
Yeah, I will. You said Novotel.
Yes.
From what time? You said
4.
4.
So
okay.
yes, 4.
All right.
By 4:30 we should be started. 6 o'clock we leave the place.
Okay. I want to say thank you for your time, really. Thank you very much, Andre and Dr. Walters. Thank you for your time. And I'm told, I think this is the second time I'm saying this, it's a very lucrative profession. So you might want to pass by the Novotel Hotel later this evening and ask the questions. How can you be trained in procurement? But it's World Kidney Day today. We're talking about it here on the AM show. Stay with us.